Hello, recording students. If you're watching this, I'm obviously not with you. I'm not dead. This isn't one of those beyond the grave videos, but I am several hundred miles away presenting at a conference. So I have pre-recorded my lecture to make sure that you get all of the benefits without me having to be there. Today we're going to talk about miking the drums. There are two things that really go into this idea. The first is preparing the kit, and then preparing the mics and setting the room for the drums. So, first thing first, you can't really do much worse than setting up the kit properly. You really want to go through and make sure that everything is set before you actually start recording. The biggest problem in a recording session is the drum kit. It is the most important thing you can possibly record, except for really light kind of elevator music type jazz. It has to be really present and really loud. But problems usually will occur. These can be either the kit itself, where you have bad heads, crummy cymbals, broken cymbals, that has happened before, bad mounts and metal parts, loose nuts, anything like that. Or you can have a really bad drummer. That one in particular, if there's one person that's going to take the blame for a bad session, it's probably the drummer or you, the engineer. Recording in general can be difficult for a lot of people, but for drummers in particular, this is something that they either love or fear. It is extremely different from performing live, and it can really throw a lot of drummers off because they typically think that they, as the drummer, have the perfect metronomic on the beat pulse, and then they find out that they don't. One thing to really consider is that you need to have a killer kit. And this is really important. Does the kit fit the sound of the project that you're working on? If you're working on a jazz tune, you probably want a kit that has a really good hi-hat sound, decent snare that sounds good with brushes, but the kick is not as important. If you're working on a speed metal track, you need a really, really good kick drum, and you probably are going to want to have double bass pedals on it. So, worst case scenario, you will have to go out and rent a kit. Most music stores are more than happy to accommodate that. Places like Guitar Center occasionally will do that, if you know the manager. But then there are other stores like Marshall Music in Lansing that specializes in renting equipment. And of course, when you're working with drums, use a click track, no exceptions. I don't care how good they think they are, they're not going to play directly on the beat. And while it's okay to let them deviate a little bit, the downbeat has to be precise. Otherwise, other people in the band will start complaining. That's just going to happen. To get a really great kit sound, you're going to have to really consider the individual parts of the drum. With the drum construction, there are a number of considerations like the shell size. The shell meaning the wooden and metal parts of the drums, not the heads, which are the membrane that gets hit. With the shell, a larger shell is going to be a lower pitch. The bigger you go, the lower the pitch. With the depth of the shell, how much it is from one end of the head to the other, that will give you a longer decay, but it will also dull your attack time. And then the shell thickness. Thinner will be more resonant, thicker will not be, but thicker is probably what you're going to find if you get your kit off of Craigslist or from your cousin who is 13 and just bought his first drum kit. The material is probably the most important aspect for creating a good drum tone, though. By and large, a lot of people are going to sell maple kits. You see those because they're really just a nice even tone across the spectrum. If you want something that's going to be a little bit more warmer and bassy sounding, you're probably going to want to go mahogany, but the price is going to go up. On the other end of the spectrum, birch is a very, very popular material, particularly in metal and in a lot of pop recordings. It is very hard, very dense, very bright sounding. You're going to have the drums really cut through the mix with that. Problem is, it's also very, very expensive. So a lot of kits are made nowadays out of poplar, which is close to birch, but significantly cheaper. It's also a little bit less dense, so they are a little bit more prone to breaking if you abuse the kit. They also have basswood, which is going to be similar to mahogany, but cheaper, and luan, which is another derivative that's like mahogany, but much, much cheaper. Then I can already guess some of you are probably thinking, what about those cool acrylic kits that I see? Just avoid those. They sound awful. Yeah, they look cool. They're day glow. They react well to black lights, and you can put glow sticks in them. Just trust me, no one uses those on recording. They sound terrible. The interior of the shell will also give you a pretty large amount of control over the pitch. If you are buying a kit, you want to take a look inside the shell and see if it's rough or smooth. A smooth interior is going to let the sound bounce off of the interior parts more. It's not going to decay as quickly and absorb the sound as a rough interior would. So rough interior, because of all the rough grain of the wood that's still available, is going to deaden the sound and make it less resonant, whereas a smooth, nicely sanded interior will make it more resonant. Next you have the bearing, or hoops, the edges, if you will. These are going to be sharper around the cut of the edge, and if they are sharper, then the brighter the drum will sound. If they are more rounded and kind of curved at the edge, it will deaden the drum. It will just kind of cut off a little bit of the extra bouncing around of sound waves inside the drum and make it a little dead. With the hoop type and number of bolts, keep in mind thicker hoops are easier to tune, and fewer bolts mean more complex harmonics. This may not be ideal, however. You might want fewer harmonics, in which case you don't want that. With the heads, for the love of all that is holy, replace them before recording if you can. Never, ever, ever use old, worn-out heads on a recording for anything other than the most experimental music, or if you're really trying to create that horrible trash can kick drum effect because you're doing sound design for a film project. Otherwise, new heads, maybe have them on for a week so they settle down. You don't have to keep retuning all of the tensioners on the hoop, but keep them new. In general, you'll need to experiment and find heads that fit the kit. There's going to be different ones that will be more resonant and ones that will be less resonant, so play around and work until you find the sweet spot for your particular kit. And keep in mind, this will not be the same for every drum. You might have a super resonant snare drum and a very, very dead bass drum, and that might be appropriate for the sound that you're going for. So it is a multi-year practice to get this right. It's very similar to finding the perfect set of strings for a guitar, for example. When you're tuning, this is something that if you're not comfortable doing, you should get someone who is. It's not like you're going to break through the head, but it's really easy to do this poorly. When you tune, you want to make sure that each lug has the exact same amount of tension. And if you are taking a look and following around in your book, they actually show you on page 124 how to tune the lugs. So they basically are creating a star pattern, similar to how when you're taking off the tires on your car, you kind of want to make a pentagram or a hexagram, depending on however many lugs you have. In the case of drums, it's typically going to be 8. So follow the pattern that they have on page 124. You want to hit directly in front of each lug, about an inch away into the drum, and hear and see, is it the same tone? And then you want to adjust each lug by tightening it or loosening it until the sound is the same. If you tighten the lug, then the pitch should go up, and if you loosen it, it should go down, unless you've managed to reverse thread the screws, in which case you are in a lot of trouble and are going to have to pay to get that fixed. Then, once you have the same sound, roughly, at every single lug, you want to hit the center, and it should have an even decay. With drums that have a top and a bottom head, you want to make sure that the bottom head is tuned to the same pitch as the top head as well. So double check by hitting the center of the top, then go underneath and hit the bottom. And because these are drums, they have a ton of overtones. They generally are producing very noisy frequencies, so it's very hard to use a chromatic tuner to check this. You will have to rely on your ears. If you feel like that's not enough, by all means set up a mic, one on top, one on bottom, record the mic. Not a big deal, and it will save you a lot of trouble. You can tune the top and the bottom heads to the exact same pitch, but you don't always have to. Doing that will give you the best tone and sustain for any particular drum, but if you want to adjust them to get different effects, you can do that too. If the top is higher than the bottom, then you're going to have a deeper sound with more bass and sustain, but if the bottom head has a higher pitch than the top, then you'll get a noticeable pitch drop effect when playing and a very short sustain. That can be used very effectively in some styles. It's not super common in a lot of styles in the US though, although you do see that on hip hop occasionally. When you're tuning between the drums, this would be from, say, a low tom to a mid tom to a high tom. Traditionally, and this is only traditionally, they are a perfect fourth apart. This is primarily because that's limited by how low you can tune the floor tom away from the kick drum. They're both low, they're bassy. That is about the amount you can get where you can hear distinct pitches between the two drums. You don't want to really bring them closer than that, otherwise it starts getting lost and you create a lot of sonic mud. You'll hit a lot of problem frequencies and you'll have some things that will sound not necessarily like phasing, but closer to comb filtering if you have them hitting both drums simultaneously. In general, what you want to do when you tune the drums is to start with the smallest drum. If you're doing toms, it would be a tom. If it's a bongo, it's going to be the higher one. Get it to resonate really well. Just really hit it, find that sweet spot where everything is just perfect, you know, it sustains, it's perfect, it's right here. Then tune in fourths, going down every drum until you get to your lowest one. Do all of that, then double check the floor tom with the bass to make sure that they are far enough apart. There are going to be a couple things that you run into in terms of issues you're going to want to be very, very cognizant of. One is snare buzz. Holy cow, snare buzz is annoying. And if you are not using the drum kit, the first thing you want to do, say you're recording in the room, you want to do guitar overdubs, loosen the snares. Just take them off and let the drum sit there. It will still stay at the right humidity and temperature level in the room, but the snares won't buzz if the guitarist hits that frequency sweet spot. But to avoid snare buzz, you want to make sure that the snares are straight and that they are at the center of the drum head. If you're getting buzz still, you can loosen the bottom head a little bit or use a different snare. There are many, many types of snares. Some particular manufacturers, like Black Swamp Percussion, make different types of snares built into the same drum. And so you've got a multi-lever system to engage type 1, type 2, type 3. I think they go up to like 7 different types. They're very cool. If you hear too much snare ring, then you want to tune the heads to a lower pitch, or you can use a heavier head, or you can mute it. And there are a number of ways of muting a snare drum. You can get special drum mutes, which are traditionally plastic rings that go on top of the drum head. You can get the more modern types, which look like a C-clamp and just go on to one position and help to mute some of the vibrations. Or in a pinch, a little bit of duct tape, but don't do that on heads that you want to use for more than one gig. If your kick drum is dull and lacks punch, consider how you're muffling inside the drum. Traditionally, a lot of people like to put blankets inside there or a sandbag or any type of ballast to really absorb some of the sound. They have different sounds. So some people might want a blanket. That might not be enough for you. You might have to go with something heavier, like 2 blankets, or even just stuffing packing material in there. Not the peanuts that would create a rattle, but like shipping plastic or something like that. You can also use a heavier head. That will give it a little bit more of an attack. Or you can use a thinner front head or a cutout. And if you really need to make a cutout in a bass drum head, I don't recommend this unless you're really in a pinch, but what you can do is you can get a small pot lid and heat it up on the stove until it is red hot, and gas stoves are going to be best for this if you have one. Then you want to put it on the head and twist until it goes through, just a little bit. That will give you a perfect circle hole right there without any sharp edges. Again, do not do that unless you are in a pinch and that is the only other option you have. Buy a head with a hole. For toms that are hard to tune or that are growling, generally it's going to be the top head that needs to be replaced because that's the one that you're hitting. But also check the tension on both the top head and on the bottom head. If they're out of sync in terms of the tension and the pitch that they are resonating at, you'll get something really weird sounding or just a bit of growl. Cymbals are an interesting animal. In general, for live performances, you want heavier cymbals, but you want lighter ones in the studio. And this is because the heavier cymbals are really resonant and sound almost like the classic Chinese opera gongs in the studio. And so they have just way more overtones. And especially if you're in a room with a lot of exposed stone or concrete or glass, it's going to reflect like crazy. You'll have all of these cymbal upper harmonics bouncing around that are just going to bleed through like crazy and deaden the overall effect by effectively phasing it. So go with a lighter cymbal and you will get a much, much better tone in the studio. That said, do not mix heavy and light cymbals when you're recording unless there's no other option. You want either all lights or all heavies because heavier cymbals will drown out the lighter ones and require just stupefying amounts of compression and volume adjustments that you have to do on the drum tracks. It's a huge pain. If you really have to do it, put the heavy cymbal on a separate track in an ISO booth or in the same room with all the other cymbals removed and have the drummer just record that one cymbal on its own. Doing that, yes, they're going to sound super processed. It's unavoidable. So yeah, go for light cymbals or heavy cymbals, ideally light, but don't mix them. In general, there is a small pre-recording checklist. This is similar to the pre-recording checklist for guitars or pianos or any other instruments. So, are the heads new on the drums? At the very minimum, you should use new heads on the tops. Are the drums in tune? Well, hopefully, yes. I mean, that's why the drummer has tuned them. Are there sympathetic vibrations? Meaning, if I hit the kick drum and slap the bass, does that cause the snares to vibrate if the snares are engaged on the snare drum? If that's happening, then you need to adjust the tuning so that that does not happen. Is there too much ring? If there is, mute it with some tape. Just regular masking tape works pretty well. Don't use duct tape unless you're going to replace the heads immediately. Oh, is the hardware quiet? All of the things like the hi-hat mounts with the associated pedals, are you getting squeaks out of those? If you are, you need to lube it up with some WD-40 or silicone grease. Either can be had at your local hardware store for very cheap and are safe to use on the chain link that is used in that. Then, are the cymbals the same volume? Again, light cymbals all around or heavy cymbals all around, don't mix and match. And then one thing that you might want to really consider having as a spare is to have an alternate snare drum on hand. You might need it. When I'm recording, if I have access to a second one, I usually like to have it there just as an option. It might be that the drummer's favorite snare sounds great on stage, but terrible in the room that they're being recorded in. So that is the pre-recording checklist. Now, in terms of actually recording the drums, this part is where it gets really complicated. There is no particular perfect way. So just get that up front that you're going to have to adjust all of these. These are just selected techniques that I have personally used that the book talks about, and I can vouch that yes, they work. As we're following along in this, I will tell you that there are different parts you should really know. I will just let you know on which page to go over. But let's get started. Again, the drum is the most important instrument when you are recording a pop band, a country band, R&B, hip hop, dubstep, whatever. Anything that has a drum kit, the drum is the central thing that has to be recorded well, or you will kill the track. Wimpy drums equals a wimpy sound. That said, there are tons of ways to mic the drums, but they will all be very, very dependent on a number of factors. And you need to consider those and try different things out when you're setting up for recording to figure out what way works best. You need to really consider the sound of the kit, the sound of the room, how much reverb there is naturally, how things are bouncing around. Is it a long decay? Is it a short decay? Is the room primarily carpeted and deadened with sound-absorbing materials, or is it all stone and glass? You also really need to consider the mics that you're using for the drums. Some mics are just going to sound better as overheads, and some are just going to sound better up close. The most important thing, though, is to consider the kit to be a single unit. Yes, you're going to have a lot of mics out there potentially. If at all possible, I like to use at least 8 mics on the drum kit. But when I'm mixing everything and when you hand your recording off to a mixing engineer, what they're going to do is to put the drums into a group track. They're going to balance the sound individually within the levels, and then they're going to use the group to balance that with all of the other instruments. So we're looking for the overall sound of the kit, not the sound of individual parts. So before you go in and do anything with the actual drummer, just before recording, go in and listen to them play. Get a feel for the tone. Yeah, you might have to have earplugs in because it's going to be pretty loud. Then put a single mic 8 or 10 feet in front of the kit at the head height using a condenser. And record a minute or two of the drummer, then bring him back and listen to the recording to see what sticks out. Is the recording balanced? Are you getting a pretty good sound from every drum? Is there too much cymbal? Are the toms too loud? Just kind of sketch everything out on a piece of paper in terms of what you have and what you need. Do you need to fix things with mics? Does stuff have to be tuned? Or do you just flat out have to replace stuff? You very well might have to. It might be that the drum just doesn't work. In terms of general considerations, if you are aiming at the center of the drum, you get a better attack sound. if you're aiming at the body of the drum, you get better sustain. When you're testing the mics, you want them to hit roughly once per second. That way any decay will happen and it will go from 0 all the way up and then back down with full silence. Mics that are under the drum should be at a 90-degree angle to the top mics to minimize phasing. We've talked a little bit about phasing, but yes, it does happen with drums as well. And most underside mics, when you place them, will be out of phase. So if your mixing console or your DAW has a phase switch, flip the switch, listen to it. If you notice less bass, you're phasing, so flip it the opposite direction and use that one. Keep the mics parallel as much as possible. Don't have the mics going into a nice 90-degree angle. That will create instant phasing, so avoid that. And a big consideration is keep the mics out of the range of the sticks. Nothing will ruin a drum track faster than having the drummer accidentally hit the mic and then, wow, that's great. Your wonderful Super Duper Earthworks $1,400 mic is now bent at an angle because the drummer got a little aggressive. Another thing is really use room mics to pick up the ambient sound of the room. It is a big part of the sound of the kit. You want some of that reflection off of hard surfaces. That really does contribute to how people perceive the drums. And so you're going to hear things, if you close mic the drums, that are not as realistic. You need a little bit of that ambient sound to really bleed through and bring everything together. So the first thing we're going to start with is minimal mics. You will definitely be quizzed on these, so please mark these off in your book as I go over them. In general, these are going to be 1 to 4 mics, and once again, I have tried all of these. These all work, so I can vouch for them. First one is the single mic. This is on page 132, so go ahead and put a star next to technique number 1. This is actually a surprisingly good and realistic way to record the drums if they're isolated. What you want to do is to think of an equilateral triangle with the bass being the total width of the kit from the end of one stand to the end of another stand for the hi-hat and the ride. You want to position a mic at the apex of that triangle so you get a perfect equilateral triangle, ideally above the center of the kit. You'll want to start with a cardioid, but experiment with other patterns as needed. That works really pretty well. It's a good baseline. It's a good way to test it. Next one we're going to go to is technique number 5, and this is placing a mic over the center of the kit, even with the top of the drummer's head. You want to angle it just a little bit over the toms, but not pointing too much at the cymbals. This is a really, really good technique for figure 8 mics. So if you have a ribbon mic or if you have a mic with switchable capsules to go with the figure 8, this works surprisingly well, and you can get some really good images. If you're doing the figure 8, you're going to want to consider taking the mic and shifting it 90 degrees off axis so that it's picking up to the left and the right, and then angle it down a little bit. That way you'll get a really good stereo image if you do 2 copies of it and then phase them out. For the 2 mic setups, this is page 134, number 1. This is a very, very efficient way to do a really good drum sound, and it was common practice until the late 60s when people were like, hey, we can get more mics. The classic 2 mic setup is technique number 1, and that is to place one mic on a short stand approximately 6 inches away from the bass drum, and a second mic about a foot above the drummer's head, pointing at the center of the kit. A couple considerations. have someone else move the overhead to find the best position while you are listening on the recording console. So sit there and record and monitor with headphones or with the speakers and give them directions of, come forward, back, to the right, to the left, whatever. Doing this, you may want to add a little EQ bump for the overhead mic at approximately 10 to 12 kilohertz to make things a little bit crisper. Because you've got the bass drum mic down there, that will have a tendency to kind of spike and just kind of get into a little bit of the muddier area around the 300 hertz danger zone of frequencies. So just boosting the overhead mic a little bit will help a lot to get away from that. Moving to the 3 mic setup, this is page 136. Think of these as building off of the 2 mic technique. So again, you're going to have a mic on a short stand 6 inches from the kit. You're going to put another one at the center, pointing down to the center of the kit over the head of the drummer, approximately at head level, about a foot out in front of the drummer's head. But you want to add a third pointing down at the snare. This is 3 mic technique number 1. This works really well. You get a great image of both the bass drum and the snare, which is really useful, primarily in everything except for jazz, where you're going to want more hi-hat. If you have 3 mics and that's all you're going to get, that's probably the way to do it. But there is another way, and this is technique number 2. This one also works really well. But you need a matched pair of mics. So what you do is, again, put a mic 6 inches in front of the kick, then you take a matched pair, and they must be matched or this won't work. Place one about 3 feet high over the bell of the farthest cymbal. So if your cymbal is here, you want it exactly on the edge, right there. And then you want to do that on both the left and the right side. They should be pointing straight down at 90-degree angle to the kick mic. Doing that, you get a great stereo image of the left side and the right side of the kick, plus the third mic in the center to balance things out. And you will get some bleed as it comes through from that center kick mic, even though you're not directly angling for that. That's just a really classic technique and was used on a lot of recordings. Another one you can do is technique number 5 on page 138. So use a dynamic mic approximately 1 to 4 feet in front of the kick. Then you want to put an XY pair of small diameter, small diaphragm, not diameter, mics about 4 to 5 feet above that, aimed at the outer edges. So if you take a look at the picture for the 3 mic setup alternate, they have those on a stand separate and above the drummer. This is pretty good. The XY pair works really well on drums. If you aim those at the outer edge of the toms or the cymbals, you get a nice triangular pattern that picks up a pretty good stereo image of the left and the right. And then having a dynamic in front of the kick, you're getting the kick, sound pressure is coming out and hitting the mic directly from the kick, but you're avoiding picking up as much of the bleed because you're using a dynamic mic. It's a nice alternate, and using that, you will get a pretty effective stereo image. Moving on to 4 mics, basically what you're doing is you're taking a 3 mic setup, and if it doesn't have a dedicated snare already, you're adding a dedicated snare. So technique number 1 is to just add a snare to anything there. Technique number 3 is the next one that we're going to look at. This is on page 139. What you want to do is close mic the kick from 1 to 2 feet away, close mic the snare from 1 to 2 feet away on the side, but looking in, pointed at the snare drum. Take a look at the picture. It's figure 8.11 on page 139. Then you want to place pair overheads in ORTF configuration about a foot above the drummer's head, looking directly in the middle of the kit. This ORTF pair may need to go up or down to get the best balance as needed, but generally you want this to go down closer to head height. This will create an image closer to what the drummer himself is actually hearing, and it will boost the snare a little bit extra, giving you just a little bit more sound at that level. Now we get to the fun part. This is where everything is going to start getting crazy, and you're going to have to start using more and more mics. Traditionally, drum mic kits come with about 8 mics, but you can go smaller or you can go higher. When you're miking the drums individually, it's more or less the standard practice now, but it's not necessarily better than a minimal setup, particularly in live performances where you need to quickly cut the sound of the drums because they're feeding back from the mics or because they're just drowning out the bassist or the guitarist or whatever, and you need to quickly find, 8 faders across a mixer that you have to take down proportionally. This offers much more control, but it takes a lot more work to prep and place the mics, and it takes a lot more work in the mixing stage of post-production. If you're going to do this, the best practice is to set these up first, and then the rest of the instruments are going to be just a total breeze in comparison. First one you want to think of is the kick. This is number 1 on page 140. The kick is the most important drum in the mix in modern pop music, period, end of story. It is always the downbeat. Considerations though. Super large kicks can produce a fundamental lower than the room that you're recording in, so you may be hearing an overtone and not the fundamental. In that case, you need to consider that maybe using a smaller drum would be better, or possibly adjusting the tuning. Also consider damping material. Have extra things like newspapers, blankets, towels, foam, whatever on hand to add as needed. If you need to dampen the head, felt can work really well. You can get piano felt from music supply stores pretty easily. It's a great tool to use for that. If there is too much ringing, you can put a pillow in the kick and adjust how much it touches the beater side of the head. Again, if you have to cut a hole, there's the saucepan lid. Again, better to have a pro do it though. I really take no responsibility if you decide to try and do this and end up ruining a kick drum head. Using mics on the kick drum. Condensers tend to overload and clip like no one's business. So dynamics are preferred, and there are specific mics that are made for kick drums like Sure's Beta 52, which we've got downstairs. To get more attack on a kick drum, boost around 8 kilohertz. If you want more kick specifically, boost the 50 to 100 hertz. If you're hearing a little bit of honking type noise, it's kind of hard to really explain, but cut at about 1.5 kilohertz. And then if you're getting like a muddy sound or kind of a beach ball type hit, like one of the inflatable pop type sounds, that would be about 160 to 400 hertz. Usually it's going to be closer about the 300 hertz area. When you're tracking kick drums, do not use the limiter unless you absolutely have to, because it's just blowing out your mic for whatever reason. Very sparingly, if at all. Okay, placement. So this is technique number 1. What you want to do is place a mic at the edge of the hole in the head, 30 to 45 degrees off axis, aiming at the beater on the opposite side. Technique number 2, page 141. Is there no hole? Well, you can put the mic 3 to 4 inches in front of the drum at the level of the beater and then move it around a bit to change the sound and find the most aggressive part or the most dead part depending on what you need. Moving up to page 143, this is technique number 6. If you need more aggression, and this would be more metal or hard rock, tape a large coin to the drum head so the beater hits it and helps to rattle and diffuse the kick. This would be like a really large coin, like a old JFK silver dollar. If you have one of those, you might be able to find them on eBay or in banks. Or a lot of people who were in the military have challenge coins. Use one of those. They work really well, and you can buy cheap generic ones online. Next technique. This is using a ribbon mic. So this is technique number 8. Put it approximately 1 to 6 feet away from the outside of the drum. Make sure it's pointed at a 45-degree angle, aimed at the floor, or you will blow out the ribbon. Do not point the ribbon element directly at the kick drum, and especially at the hole in the kick drum. That will destroy it. Be very careful with ribbon mics on the kick. This is the kick tunnel. This is a really cool thing to do to isolate the kick drum mic. So effectively, this is creating a megaphone in reverse. You're taking the kick drum at one end, you're taking the mic at the other end, and then you're constructing a layer of fabric or duct tape or plastic wrap or whatever around the two to keep it from otherwise diffusing and getting picked up in the room. It's really cool to do that by using blankets like the ones you get in a U-Haul when you're moving. You can just put them up on chairs around there and then create a tunnel that way. It usually lowers the resonant frequency of the drum head in the recording, so you may have to tune the drum up a bit to compensate. There's really good information about that on page 144. But for the placement of that, technique number 1 is to make a tunnel using chairs, blankets, and mic stands. It's quick, it's easy to do, and you would not believe how many times I've had to do that. An alternate technique is to cut the bottom off of a gallon of milk and stick that around the mic. So you want the mic to go in where you would pour the milk out, and then just duct tape it down, and then place the open end on the opposite side close to the drum. Use a dynamic mic. Please do not use a condenser with this. You're going to get some really bad sound. If you have a sub-kick mic, good luck finding the Yamaha NS10, but that was a particular speaker that they used, and they wired it in reverse, and then you would get really cool bass frequencies that way. But you can buy specific sub-kick mics. Check Sweetwater or another store for that. For the sub-kick, on page 145, they tell you to place it 2 inches from the outer head of the kick, bring up the regular kick mic, and add 10% or so for the sub-kick. You don't want to go too much more than that. If you do, it will start to feedback. For the snare, the biggest consideration for the snare is the quality of the drum and the quality of the drummer. If you've got a good drum and a good drummer, you're set, you're golden. If you have a bad one or the other, you can replace either. And it might be easier to replace the drummer in some situations. Considerations for miking the snare: SM57 all the way. It's the standard. In fact, in every drum mic kit you buy, there will be an SM57 or there will be a knockoff 57. The crack when hitting the snare is coming from the bottom of the drum. So if you need more crack, you can put the mic lower or even on the bottom of the drum. If you need to crisp up the snare, a 10 to 12 kilohertz boost will work for that. And slight amounts of compression will help to smooth out the peaks in the recording just a little bit. I personally prefer not to compress when I'm actually recording, so I would do that in post. Placement. This is technique number 1. This is the standard SM57. You get a boom, put the 57 on the boom, put it 1 inch above the rim. And if you take a look at page 146, you will see exactly what that looks like. The ring of the mic should be just over the rim and point it at a slight angle towards the center of the drum. Classic. Technique number 2 on 147 is to place the SM57 6 inches above the rim of the snare. Aim it at a 45-degree angle towards the center of the drum. This is a much more natural sound, according to some people, and it's a much better choice if the drummer is playing side stick, as it keeps the mic out of the way of the stick. Then, technique number 7, this is from page 149. Cut the bottom off a milk jug and use the top to shield the mic down to the handle, similar to a kick tunnel. This will help for isolation and getting the hi-hat out of the mix quite a bit. It's also a little intimidating to the drummer because they see this big milk jug sticking out in front of them. So as a variation, you can use a styrofoam cup instead. Just make sure you tape everything down really well. But if you need to intimidate the drummer by having this big object out in front of them so they don't accidentally hit stuff, that's a good way, and it does give you pretty good isolation. Again, same considerations as with the kick tunnel. It will change the resonant frequency, so you'll probably have to tune up the drum on the top head just a little bit. If they are using brushes on the snare, I really hate dealing with those, but there are a couple of considerations, and those are the sound takes more space to develop than the sticks. So overhead and room mics are going to be more important. And as much as I hate them, they are a classic for jazz sound. They're a little quieter, they're much easier to get lost in the mix. That's kind of why I'm not a fan. So the best way to do it is technique number 2 from page 150. Take any dynamic mic, but again, an SM57 is pretty much the standard, and place it 1 inch from the shell, pointed at the center to pick up the snare brushes. With the hi-hat, you will get bleed in the snare mic. That's just going to happen no matter what you do, but adding a second mic gives you more control over the overall dynamics of the hi-hat, which is why people do it. For considerations, lighter hats are better than heavy ones due to issues with the overtones. If you get a heavier hi-hat, you will get massive overtones that you probably don't want. Generally speaking, close miking too closely will pick up air noise from the hi-hat as they open and close it, and that will push stuff out. Condensers are going to be better at picking up the full frequency range, but you will need to use the mic pad and cut 10 decibels or more, pretty much as a matter of course. For placement considerations, generally you're going to want to place the mic on the far end of the hat away from the cymbals. This is just to prevent bleed, and really because if they hit the cymbals, they're going to really hit it. Again, boosting 10 to 12 kilohertz is kind of the sweet spot for most percussion. That will add some sizzle to the hi-hat. If you're doing hi-hats, you're going to want to filter out anything below 160 hertz. That's a lot of snare and kick drum bleed that's going to be happening there. And honestly, you might want to play around with that and take it up even a little higher. I've seen some people, when they're miking these, cut out everything below 300 hertz on the hi-hat. If the hi-hat is sounding too heavy, you're going to want to cut around 1 to 1.5 kilohertz, or you can just move the mic away a little bit. For placement of the hi-hat, this is just technique number 1, page 151, and it has a picture. Place a mic pointing straight down above the top cymbal, halfway between the center and the rim, on the opposite side from where the drummer is hitting. You really don't want them to hit that. That's pretty much the classic, though. Next, we have the toms. More than anything, this is the sound of the kit when the drummers are talking about that. This is what they want you to bring up, is the toms, even though they probably won't say that. They'll be like, oh, give me more bass. No, you want more floor tom. Considerations are that condensers will give you more attack and less thump. So if you want more thump, get more dynamic mics. Placing the mic between the lugs can get a better sound than placing it at any other position. If you place it over a lug directly, they tend to have a little bit of a resonance cut there on the drum itself. When doing multiple toms, you want to keep the mics facing in the same direction as much as you possibly can. This will avoid phasing issues, but again, the idea is to keep them pointing in the same direction, and especially to avoid 90-degree placements at any cost. Boosting at the 5 kilohertz range will add attack. Boosting at 8 kilohertz adds presence. Cutting at 1.5 kilohertz will make things thinner, while cutting at 4 to 500 hertz gets rid of muddiness. And with toms, that is a serious consideration because their fundamentals are occurring in the same place as guitars, as some of the higher bass notes, and where a lot of male singers are going to be hitting their notes, and actually a fair amount of female singers too. Doing top and bottom miking in pairs can be good, but it does always produce huge phasing issues with the toms. So in general, you probably want to avoid that. Miking pairs of toms is generally a safer bet than miking individually, especially when there is a large kit. You can do either one mic for every 2, or in some extreme cases, one mic for every 3 if you've got like a John Bonham or Neil Peart type setup. Small amounts of gaff tape is the perfect way to mute toms without killing the attack. And you can get gaff tape online dirt cheap. I recommend the fabric type, not the plastic type. Miking underneath is also a really, really good option in terms of managing bleed on the toms. If you're getting way too much bleed from the cymbals, stick the mic underneath. Also, remember, as we talked about earlier, you can change the tuning of the heads on both the top and the bottom to get different notes that will boost the bass presence of the toms. And in the studio, once you're doing stuff on the console, gating can help get rid of ring in the recordings. But if you do it, it's a really dated effect, and it will tend to kill your snares and kick as well. If you're going for that 1980s Phil Collins sound, though, gate it. But otherwise, if you do it, I will seriously consider failing you. Just kidding about that. Not really, but, you know, whatever. Disclaimer. Placement technique for toms. This is shown on page 153 as number 1. You want to do the classic, then you place the mic 2 to 3 inches off the head, over the rim at a 45-degree angle, pointed at the center of the head. For floor toms, you want it 2 to 4 inches over the head and down at a 45-degree angle aimed at the center of the head. So that is technique number 4. For the overhead mics, this is where things really kind of come together. There are 2 schools of thought on the overhead mics. One is that they capture the entire kit and are used to add room presence and just ambience to the kit. Another school of thought is that they are mostly used for cymbals. So first considerations, if you're using a set of condensers, which you probably should be doing if you're using these for overheads, use the mic pads. The output is going to be really stupidly high by default. You are dealing primarily with transients, cannot talk today, and you are in a small and probably enclosed room. So pad, pad, pad. Generally speaking, an XY configuration will be the clearest you're going to get, but that might not always be the case. Sometimes ORTF might be better. If the room is too live, you can mitigate that a little bit and get rid of some of the reflections by moving the mic closer to the kit. Next, high passing on the mic or at the console will clean up the cymbals. So on the mics, like some of the Sures that we have downstairs, you have the built-in low cut, low shelf filters. Use those. That's what they're there for, to get rid of the low frequency noises. And then, of course, make sure that the entire kit is balanced when listening to just the overheads. So if you're using them as room mics, go ahead and record some stuff. Solo the overheads and listen to how they sound, and make sure that you can hear all of the individual parts of the drum kit. If you can't, you need to adjust them. If you're using overheads for cymbals, check the balance just on the cymbals and move them as needed to capture more of each cymbal. Placement technique number 1. This is from page 156. You can get the entire kit by using an XY pair approximately 2 feet above the drummer's head, centered over the middle of the kit. As a variation of this, variation number 1 suggests, and I concur, to use an ORTF placement. Again, still 2 feet above the drummer's head, centered over the middle of the kit. In either case, you can move those mics up or down to balance the sound. The next idea, and this is technique number 6 on page 158, put an Omni mic above the cymbals on the hi-hat side and a cardioid over the cymbals and the floor tom, angled slightly pointing into the room and away from the drum. This one works surprisingly well if you want a bigger sound. It can get a really good image from the Omni, but then having the cardioid angled slightly out towards the room, you pick up a little bit more of the reverb. So if you're going for a bigger sound, this can be the way. But this one is really dependent on the quality of the room itself. For room mics, this adds glue between the individual mics. So you would use room mics in addition to the overheads, the tom mics, the snare mic, the hi-hat mic, the cymbals mic, and the kick drum mic. Here's the thing though, why are you miking the room? That is the biggest consideration. Do you need more ambience? Then, yeah, a single mic pointed away from the drums might be good. If you need a bigger drum sound, then placing a mic or two at the place in the room that sounds the best for the drums, just by walking around and listening, holding a hand over your ear, checking with the other ear, and seeing how everything changes around based on your position. Generally, for smaller rooms, a figure-8 pattern will work better, but not always the case in larger rooms. In larger rooms, you might want to go to a cardioid or even an Omni mic. Fewer mics used on the drums, then the more effective the room mics will be in terms of reinforcing the overall sound of the kit. So if you're using a single mic to a 3 mic setup or even a 4 mic setup, then yeah, room mics can be very necessary. If, however, you're using a mic on every individual drum and then throwing that all onto a bus and then compressing and then running it through a reverb module and then adding convolution to make it sparkle, then don't bother with the room mics. You're basically defeating the purpose and you'll probably get phasing. For room mics, because you're trying to capture the ambience of the room, boosting at 12 to 14 kilohertz will open it up and make it a little bit more airy in the mix. If you have way too much cymbal, then move the room mics closer to the floor, because the cymbals, by and large, are going to be reflecting above the cymbal themselves and not closer to the floor. It will spread out eventually, but the higher overtones are going to be on the upper side. For placement techniques, this is number 1 on page 159. Place a mic 6 to 10 feet away from the outer edge of the farthest cymbal on either side of the kit. They must be the same height and perfectly parallel. This is just basically a classic A-B mic setup. It's pretty effective. Technique number 3 on the same page, 159. So have the drummer play only the snare and then find the place where the room really, really seems to crack like a whip with the snare and put a mic there. That's a really, really good position. And when mixing, you're going to want to consider gating that track using the close mic'd snare to trigger the gate. This would be using sidechaining, but that way it really kind of closes and opens things so that you get a much better snare sound overall. Next one is technique number 4 on page 160. This is probably my favorite way to do room mics. You need 3 mics, and you place 2 of them about 3 feet away from the farthest outside edge of the outermost cymbals on the right and the left. Then you put a 3rd mic in the center. Set them at the level of the drummer's head and point the center mic down at the snare and adjust as needed. Then you pan the outer mics hard left, hard right on the console and leave the 3rd mic in the center. This gives you a really great room sound, and it gives you a lot to work with in terms of what you're doing with the individual mics on the drums. But that's about it. This is a lot to take in, and there's some other stuff in the chapter about how to get distinctive drum sounds if you decide you want to go through those. But for what I'm going to test you on, let me just go back through that all, and I will give you specific page numbers. For chapter 7, preparing the drum kit for recording, anything in there is fair game. So please study chapter 7. For chapter 8, you definitely want to know the section before you begin and general considerations on page 131 and 132. For the minimal mic setups, single mic, you want to know technique 1 on page 132, followed by technique 5 on 134. For 2 mic setups, you want technique 1 on 134. For 3 mic setups, you want techniques number 1 and 2 on page 136, and technique number 5 on page 138. For the 4 mic setups, you want techniques number 1 and number 3 on page 139. For the individual drums, and this goes for all of them, so kick, snare, hi-hat, toms, everything, you want to know the considerations for all of those. For miking the kick, you want technique number 1 on page 140, technique number 2 on page 141, technique number 6 and technique number 8 on page 143. Then you also want to know the kick tunnel and placement technique for the kick tunnel on page 144, and the sub kick and the considerations for the sub kick on page 145. For miking the snare, again, you need to know the considerations. And then you need technique number 1 on page 146, technique number 2 on 147, and technique number 7 on page 149. Also, for brushes on the snare, you need to know technique number 2, which is on page 150. For the hi-hat, you need to know all the considerations, and then placement technique number 1 on page 151. For miking the toms, considerations start on page 152. Then you need page 153, technique number 1. and page 154, technique number 4. Moving to overheads, considerations are on page 155, and you need to know placement technique number 1 and variation number 1 on page 156, and technique number 6 on page 158. Room mic considerations are pages 158 and 159. On page 159, you also need technique number 1 and technique number 3. And then on page 160, you need technique number 4. Any and all of those could be on the test, so please go over those. If you have any questions, please feel free to watch the video again. I realize it's a lot of information to take in, but I will be available by email if you need to get in touch with me. And if you do, just send me an email. Good luck.